Hello everyone, my name is Rob, welcome to Kingston Rugby League. In this video I'm going to be giving you my Round 4 Super League Power Rankings. Now this week has been a bit of a tricky one. It's been tough trying to decide who to place above who, even though results wise they're pretty much as expected aside from say Helens and Salford, but in terms of the context of each of those games, it's kind of all over the place. So there's going to be a few changes up this week, but let's crack on with 12th place. Remaining in 12th place after round 4 is the London Broncos. Again, I really wanted to move them up one, but I couldn't do it. I've got to say, what a cracking effort. I know that sounds really silly to say after losing 60-22, but they made Wigan look a little bit chaotic at times, and that's possibly due to the players that Wigan had for that game. But to go against a close to fully fit or fully on-field Wigan team, and to put up that many points, to create opportunities, to actually look dangerous multiple times, and not just the only times when they scored, they created things for themselves, which is a really positive sign. But of course, the main reason why they are still there is they conceded 60 points. Whether it was Wigan's full team or not, you just can't be doing that. So I am seeing improvements week in, week out. There are, either putting up more points or conceding less. Of course, conceding less wasn't the case this week, obviously, but they're starting to find a foundation, let's say. And they've played all of the top 4 teams as of right now, which is Saints, Wigan, Catalans, and then they'll play Warrington in round 5, so they will have played the top 4 in the first 5 rounds. So that is a hell of a way to start for the Broncos, but I think they're doing a pretty decent job, basically exceeding my expectations. But for now, they're going to have to stay in 12th. Moving on to 11th place now, and moving down one at the Castleford Tigers. There is absolutely no way I can justify having them above Hull after this week. If it was kind of like the scoreline I expected, then they'd stay where they were. But to lose by that scoreline, and as far as I'm aware, I need to go back over it, but I did some quick research before, there were no cards in that game. They at least would have been a sign, or at least somewhat decent enough reason to say, this is why we've conceded 50 plus points. There's just no excuse for it. As simple as that. I gave them some praise last week after the performance against Warrington, in that they looked challenging in attack. They scored 2 tries. I mean, sometimes 2 tries can be all you need in extremely close games, but especially if it's tough conditions, you can't really spread the ball around much. Sometimes you can fall into those low-scoring games, but to allow that many points against a team that has been so up and down so far this season it's just not really acceptable. So they're going to have to come down one. There is no way I can have them above Hull. There is no way. And sometimes it'll change week to week, but that is just... there's not much more that needs to be said. It's just not acceptable. Moving on to 10th place now, and up one is Hull FC. I think the effort against Catalans was certainly valiant. The scoreline was pretty close to what I expected. I think, 26-12 in the end, I want to say. And I predicted 28-10. So, pretty close, 2 points away for both teams. The effort towards maybe the back 5-10 minutes of the first half and the first 10-15 minutes of the second half, that middle section of the game was a good contest, and they're really posing questions to Catalans. Wasn't really enough to fight back. I think maybe under different circumstances, Hull could have really pressured them a bit more for a win. So I think, given that the scoreline was as expected. I think the fact that they competed as closely as they did, they made it enough of a challenge for long enough, is more than enough reason to move them up one. That would have been a question mark for me had Castleford at least been competent against Huddersfield, but the fact that they were so poor against them means that they've got to come down one, and Hull being as competitive as they were at a certain period in the game, or by a certain period in the game, is enough reason for me to move them up one. They're still really going to struggle against a bunch of teams. When they have everyone available at full strength, what kind of Hull FC are we going to get? Is Tony Smith going to turn things around? It's a big question mark for me, but as of right now, I think those three in that order, for me, I don't really have too many questions over, but now it's going to get just a little bit tricky. Moving to 9th place now, I have the Leigh Leopards. They were the biggest question mark for me last week. For my power rankings, I had them in 7th, so they've moved down 2 this week. So it's a little bit tricky. The main reason for that is, regardless of the sin bin, you cannot just blow a 16-0 lead like that. You just can't do that. One positive thing you could say to begin with is that they took a 16-0 lead against Leeds. That's a clear positive, of course it is. And that's why even putting them down to 9th is still a bit of a question mark, because the next 3 teams, or the 3 teams including Leigh, for me, were really tricky to choose where to place. But the main justification for moving Leigh into this position is the fact that they blew the 16-0 lead. Even with a sin bin, you can't let momentum shift that much to the point where even when it's 13-13 again, you just completely blow it. You just can't let that happen. Also, the fact that I'm not too sure how long Lachlan Lamb's going to be out for. It looked pretty bad when he left the field. I've not seen yet anything about what the kind of injury is or how long he's going to be out for, if any weeks at all. But the way he walked off, it looked pretty bad. No Lachlan Lamb, no Ipape. It's looking a bit dicey for Leigh at the moment. They've had some decent performances here and there, but nothing to sing and dance about. So I think pretty much having them in 9th feels about right, given the question marks I had last week, the fact that they blew a 16-0 lead, and the losses to the spine feel very major at the moment. But I certainly wouldn't put them below Hull or Castleford or London. Certainly couldn't do that. So 9th place, Leigh Leopards. Moving on to 8th place now, and moving up one are the Huddersfield Giants. As I basically said, against Castleford, now in favour of Huddersfield, just exceeded expectations, just went above and beyond. I don't think I could have moved them up at all if they'd won the game as expected by about 8 points, it would have been okay for me to keep them below Leigh. But just, it wasn't even like a slightly improved performance. It was just completely on the other end of the spectrum to what we've seen the last couple of weeks. So a complete shift is definitely worthy of a +1 in the power rankings. To be as questionable as they've been, and to not really know where they were as a team. Like, this is the reason why a couple of weeks ago, after round 1, I provided a bet on TikTok, basically taking Saints to beat Huddersfield rather than taking the handicap, and they easily got the handicap. But this is kind of the reason why I didn't want to take the handicap, was because Huddersfield was such a question mark early on, and given that Saints had only played London, it's kind of, where are they really? And it was just round 1. So, but this is the kind of thing I was worried about. Not that Huddersfield would have put 50 past Saints, but that they could turn up like this. Because based on the squad that they had on paper, that they could at least come out with something unexpected. They could maybe pose a few questions to some of the top teams. And normally, teams at the top win against teams at the bottom with these kind of scorelines. So, based on the inconsistency of Huddersfield, around this mark still feels about right. There's no way I'm putting them like 3rd or 4th. If it's week-to-week performances, sure, they could go to 3rd or 4th. But if it's taking into context the last couple of weeks, then I think 8th feels about right for Huddersfield. And moving up one are the Warrington Wolves. I think this is also a question mark. So between Leigh, Huddersfield and Warrington, those 3 teams were quite difficult to decide where to put, because you have to take into account the sin bin for Leigh Leopards. You have to take into account just how strong Huddersfield were, and then also the strength of the opponent that Warrington faced in Kingston Rovers. And I think the reason why I can justify putting Warrington up 1 is given that they have improved week in, week out. So they are being rewarded for their improved performances. Improved difficulty of opponents as well is also another thing. To go away to Kingston Rovers and to put in that kind of effort, to be a lot more creative in attack. Defensively, there were still some holes, still some question marks. But the week-by-week improvement for Warrington has been great to see, because after round 1, it looked really, really ugly. And then in round 2 against Hull, it was kind of, okay, well, easier opponent, what we're going to get. But then the fact that Castleford posed was a tougher opponent at the time, or posed a tougher challenge that round, and then to have the grit that has been missing the last couple of years to go toe-to-toe with Kingston Rovers away from home is just a clear sign that improvements are being made week on week, and they'll get a little bit of an easier challenge, a chance to put some more points on the board and really kind of stretch themselves and get a bit of a warm-up next week against London. But again, I mean, London are improving week by week as well, and they're doing their thing. So we will see. But Warrington, defensively, yes, still question marks. Individual performances have really been helping Warrington to shine. Matt Duffy is one, for example. Leon Hayes has been really strong. Ben Curry at loose forward was a little bit quiet for me last week, but I was glad to see George Williams and Leon Hayes working together. I think they both had a great game. But yeah, Matt Duffy is the guy at the moment that's really been changing the attacking landscape for Warrington. Still question marks defensively on the right hand side with Adam Holroyd, Connor Wrench, Josh Thulis, but I'm sure that's something that I'll pay attention to for sure over the next couple of weeks to make sure that that's strengthened as the weeks go by. So this feels about right to me. I'm still unsure whether these 3 should be in this order, but this feels about right. Moving on to 6th place now, and still in 6th place are the Salford Red Devils. It is really difficult to move them up 1 just yet. There are 2 ways of looking at this game. Number 1, they looked completely out of it against Saints and managed to come back. And the second way of looking at it is they were completely out of the game until St Helens got a red card, and even then Salford still conceded a try and man down. Now, it's not impossible to do. Teams do it all the time. Teams concede, and have done multiple times this season, especially when being a man down, or a man up, sorry. But the fact that Salford conceded when they were a man up, and probably left it a little bit too late for my liking with all the time that they had. I think you can take the positive for sure, but also take the negative. For me, that just balances it out, and for me is a clear indication that 6th is about right, because they can challenge against the top teams. The circumstances helped them to do so against Saints, but I don't think the result that it was looking to be wasn't anything out of the ordinary, so there's no reason to really drop them down. So I think 6th for Salford. They haven't moved once at all. I think they're one of the only teams that hasn't moved. There's only 4 that haven't. And I think 6th is just right, because they haven't been exceptional at any point this season, but they haven't been completely poor or done anything out of the ordinary, aside from maybe the performance against Kingston Rovers in round 3. But that's about it. But 6th for Salford feels just about right. Taking a look at 5th place now, and also not changing from last week, are the Catalans Dragons. I think their performance against Hull, like results-wise, was as expected. And I mentioned previously when I was talking about Hull FC, in terms of the scoreline that I predicted, it was 2 points off for each team. So, on one hand, the game was as to be expected, but I don't think Catalan's performance was particularly clean. It was actually really dull. There was a period in the game, when they were a man up from the sin bin, they probably could have been a bit more advantageous with it. And just generally, when they got into good field position, they just weren't clean. They didn't execute very well. They looked a little bit all over the place. Sometimes were rattled, but I don't know. It didn't look particularly clean to me, and that's a big issue. I was expecting, based on the spine that they've got, and normally how efficient and clinical they are in attack, that they would destroy and really take advantage of this Hull FC team that has been poor since the start of the season. But yeah, I could maybe move them down next week, depending on how their performance goes compared to Salford, and we'll have to see how that goes. But that gap has certainly closed between them and Salford right now in the power rankings for me. And there's absolutely no way. Yes, they won, but there's no way I can move them up. Absolutely no way at all, because that was... yeah, it was a bit dull in attack. Moving on to 4th place in the power rankings now, and also non-movers, Leeds Rhinos. I think some of the ways that they scored their tries against Leigh were pretty exciting. Yes, they were aided by the sin bin, of course, but also when they got back to a level playing field, they were still the stronger team. Yes, momentum can be helpful, but we've seen that momentum can shift, and you need to be the maker of your own momentum. Key example, Hull KR versus Warrington. Momentum shifted constantly because Hull KR made it for themselves. They were down for most of the game, and then they built up the momentum themselves. So I'm basically looking at Leigh, in this case, saying you need to kind of push back. But Leeds, in this case, didn't allow them to. So they took advantage of the extra man, of course. Any team typically would, unless you're Warrington in round 1. Still bugs me that a little bit, but the way that Leeds have been, I was going to say consistent, but the fact that they were still 16 points down is obviously not a great sign, but they took their chances and opportunities when they had them later on in the game. They used it to their advantage, so it's like another balancing act, really. The same with, I've said about Salford, the same way I said about Catalans, and with Leeds this week. There are certainly negatives or reasons to kind of bump them down, and there are reasons to give them praise. So still in 4th place, Leeds Rhinos. Moving on to 3rd place now, and still in 3rd place, Hull Kingston Rovers. There isn't too much to say on this one. The main reason why they're still in 3rd is pretty much the same reason for Leeds and for Catalans and for Salford, is that there's a positive and a negative that balances out where they are. Now, if Salford or Catalans or Leeds, if their game went as I kind of expected it to go, then they certainly could have moved down below. Maybe Leeds, maybe Catalans at a push. Probably not as far down as 6th. The 2 losses in a row is, it isn't great, but I don't think it's any reason to panic. You got to keep in mind that they played against a Warrington Wolves team that has been improving week on week, and they're showing a lot more grit and determination in these close fights. Hull KR also, on the flip side, on a positive note, I should say, still had a lot of momentum throughout the game. They made their own momentum shift for probably the majority of the game. Problem is they just didn't take the chances. We can talk about conversions. I'm pretty sure Hull KR missed 6 points worth and Warrington was 8 points worth, so that kind of argument is void. Worst case, Warrington left out at least 6 points, so it still would have been a loss anyway. But again, another positive and negative for Hull KR to kind of keep them where they are. But for me, it does open up the gap to second place a little bit more in these power rankings. And the fact that not one of those, Hull KR plus the 3 below, kind of were as I expected them to be, is a clear indication that that gap to second has now opened up. But I'm not panicking for Hull. I don't think there's any reason for Hull KR fans to panic. They've had 2 pretty tough games the last few weeks, but they could really do with a strong statement win next week just to really build up the confidence in the players, in the fans, and get back to where, the expectations were, which is top 4 and playing it safe, just a playoff team. But third place for Hull, I think, is just about right for now. Moving on to second place now, and this one was really tricky to decide. It was really difficult. But still in second place is St Helens, and I'll get onto the Saints game and then I'll reference why first place is still in first place. I won't say the name yet. Again, I'll keep it a surprise. But the reason why Saints are still there is... okay, they're still there, but the gap to first is now even smaller. It is a knife edge thick in terms of distance between them and first place. They are on the cusp of taking number 1 in the power rankings. So in terms of just talking about St Helens, and then I'll give reasons why first place is still first place to kind of help add more context to Saints being second, is that yes, St Helens were a man down, but they still gave up a significant lead. So that's, of course, a huge negative to Saints. They had a pretty strong lead and they lost it. However, in their favour, it wasn't like Leigh versus Leeds, where it was only a 10-minute portion of the game where they lost momentum. It was essentially an entire half. So to at least put up points being a man down, and to lose the game towards the back end when you've had to fight with a man down for that amount of time, for me, is a huge positive on the side of St Helens. So that's why, for me, and I'll get on to first place, why that gap has been shortened is because had it just been a sin bin or 13 on 13 still, I think they would have completely wiped the floor with Salford, as they kind of were doing. So there's no reason to bring them down, because they kind of gave up a massive lead. Adding the context to it, I think they got a little bit closer to first place. But let's get on to first place and why I've still got them there. So in first place still are the Wigan Warriors. Some people, I think, really would have swapped around Wigan and Saints, and that's understandable. There's a few things to cover here with Wigan's performance. Should they have conceded 22 points against London Broncos? No. That just should not have happened. Was their performance against London in attack particularly clean? As much as they scored 60 points? No, it wasn't. I don't think Wigan were particularly clean on both sides. London asked a lot of questions of the Wigan defence, and they looked a little bit all over the place. And in attack, it wasn't particularly smooth. However, there was no Bevan French, there was no Harry Smith, and yet they still put up 60 points against the Broncos. So that is the only reason right now. Now, I had Wigan winning 50-0. That's with the assumption that French and Smith were going to play. That was the assumption I had. So the fact that they kind of exceeded that in attack without those guys is the only reason why I'm just accepting them as number 1 in the power rankings. That is the only reason that they exceeded expectations for points scored without French and Smith. That is it. They were still strong through the middle, but they did panic a little bit at times and they just weren't very clean. Jack Farrimond on that left-hand side looked a bit dodgy in times, but again, you've got to keep in mind that he's not training with the first team week in, week out. He doesn't know the exact processes. Decision making's going to be a little bit worse because he's not been in those kind of situations before. So the gap to St Helens is minuscule, but I'm only defending Wigan on the fact that, again, exceeded expectations in attack without French and Smith, but defensively, just... And of course there were other players, you know, there were a few young players in there, but it was a little bit shaky for me in defence. But the gap is so close. It is so close to any kind of slip up next week, and anything just a little bit slightly above expectation for Saints, and that's a flip. A straight swap between first and second. But yeah, this entire list has been extremely difficult, including first and second, but still in first, Wigan Warriors. So that is going to be it for this video. If you have your own power rankings, do let me know in the comments down below. This is the toughest one yet, and we're only 4 weeks in. I'd hate to think how things are going to go next week. So in terms of, you know, results, they were as to be expected for the most part, but in terms of the context and the nuances, it was all over the place. So yeah, it has been a really tricky one to do this, but I've tried to provide as much logic and reasoning as I can to say why these teams are where they are in a power rankings. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.